Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the reading group on Algis Uždavinys' book, Philosophy and Theurgy. This will be the first of, I hope, many sessions about this book. Very exciting to get this started. I'm being joined today by Ahmed. He's from Northern Africa. And I'm going to go ahead and read actually, unfortunately, a relatively long introduction to both Uždavinys and then the work, and then we'll have a good discussion after that. So let me start with discussing Uždavinys and the book. Philosophy and Theurgy could be classified as a perennialist classic. The author, Algis Uždavinys, was a Lithuanian scholar who practiced a form of Sufism that followed the philosopher, mystic, and Sufi shaykh Frithjuof Schuon. The Sufi branch was called the Maryamiyya order, which Schuon founded. I won't go into details about Schuon or the order here, but it's important to realize that Uždavinys' association with the group and the perennialist heritage limits his studies' usefulness in the eyes of late antiquity philosophy studies and the scholars who participate in those studies. In generic terms, he could be linked to the type of work that Martha Nussbaum and Pierre Hadot do, along with Michel Foucault, though his tendency for mystical and often magical insights make him related to but a bit more extreme than Hadot. This answers the question of why you won't often see his work cited in major studies on the subject. This blacklisting has not been universal, though, as we see from the foreword to this work by John Finnemore, a widely respected and recognized professional in the field. Popular scholar and writer on theurgy Gregory Shaw also cites Uždavinys' work. Another reason for his poor reputation among professional scholars is the very fact that he takes theurgy seriously. Even though other highly respected scholars have proven the intellectual integrity of Neoplatonism and theurgy, many in the field look askance at it as irrational, or as E.R. Dodds, even though he made a living off of it, the major proponent of this view, calls it vulgar magic with religious pretensions. Hopefully, as we go through this work, you will see how unfair this characterization is. To his credit, Gregory Shaw has brought some respectability to the study, and major works by Sarah Iles Johnston, Christian Bull, and John Dillon preceded Shaw's work and laid the groundwork for it. We could spend an entire session on this topic, and maybe we can add it once we successfully get through the text. But with these scattered facts in mind, I'll start to summarize as quickly and succinctly as possible tonight's reading's contents. Needless to say, such a cursory introduction can only skim the surface of what is often text, dense with meaning and often unfamiliar concepts and terms. In his foreword, John Finnemore lauds Uždavinys' work as important and worthy of consideration. Finnemore quickly draws our attention to the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, as a focusing mechanism. He draws out the point that just as Ani in the Book of the Dead describes the pharaoh's soul's progress through the underworld, it is paradigmatic for the spiritual seeker's soul who has undergone initiation and study in theurgic art. This is important, since Uždavinys makes the Egyptian book a central focus as well for his study. Finnemore points out that the Book of the Dead is important for understanding theology and philosophy of theurgy. As Uždavinys will show, gods and humans interact on both a personal and spiritual level in theurgy. Finnemore sees it as one of the larger goals of Iamblichus, the forefather of modern theurgy, to show how Plato applies to other ancient religions and religious and wisdom traditions. Theurgy brings Plato and the ancient together in Iamblichus's mind. Obviously, that will be part of what Uždavinys does in his work as well, and he mentions Iamblichus as well as the Neoplatonists throughout the book. One can think of this as Iamblichus's subtle effort to undermine Christianity, which itself tried to make the argument that it was the fulfillment of all religious interests up to and including the time that it became the imperial religion. Theurgy is a translation of God's word. That is, it makes the soul possible to turn itself into an instrument of coming in contact with the divine planes of existence and ultimately union with the transcendent one. Iamblichus, however, is patient to show that theurgy does not force the gods to participate with humans in any activity. This follows Plato's teaching in the Symposium that the gods are far above the human plane of existence. What theurgy does is to make the human purified enough so that the gods will shine their divine light and divinity upon the human soul and enable it to ascend to their place on the divine plane. The process that must occur to bring this about is via mediation by daimons. These are not demons, which is a Christian slur upon a very important and sacred Neoplatonic entity. As Iamblichus points out, daimons bring our prayers to the gods and the gods' gifts to us. They exist in this mythological view, though Iamblichus believed in its literal reality, below the moon and range as high as the planets. It is important to recognize that for Iamblichus, any coercion or other types of appeal to the gods, to material goods, is ultimately irreligious. We must make ourselves open to and available to the divine favor in the form of light and the opening up of our souls to ascent to the gods on the divine plane. Not only must we purify the body, but we must also purify our intellect. We must prepare ourselves intellectually and understand theurgic philosophy, and then carry out the sacred rituals. When these are right, the person can be lifted out of their body to join with the gods. Finnemore's quick to point out the very important concept of the ethereal body. It is an ethereal substance that houses the rational and irrational souls. It is the rational soul that unites with the gods, and possibly ultimately the one and good itself. What union does is give us the ability to come and go back to the land of the living at will. Souls unite with the universal powers, and we travel between the realms, ethereal, intelligible, and ultimately of the one. Finally, Finnemore points out that the effects of practicing theurgy bring peace, contentment, power, vindication, and divine-like status. From this forward, then, we learn that what this book is about is finding the Egyptian background to philosophy and theurgy. It investigates what we know Iamblichus had accomplished, traveled to Egypt to learn Hermetic wisdom and bring it back to his school in Syria and combine it with Chaldean theurgy and the Orphic and Pythagorean traditions. What is unique about Uždavinys' study is that it goes farther back in its understanding of the Egyptian side of the equation. Everyone knows the Greek side, but the Egyptian had been left unexplored. This has several reasons associated with it. Number one, no one had thought that there was a Hermetic aspect to Neoplatonic theurgy. They thought that Iamblichus had made it up in some form of Egyptian cosplay. Christian Bull is important in showing how this is untrue. And number two, because of the notion that theurgy was irrational, balderdash, unworthy of respect, and serious discussion, as Dodd said. We now know through Christian Bull's work that the Hermetic philosophy was indeed adopted by Iamblichus. While it probably doesn't accord with all of Uždavinys' conclusions, it does bear out the fact that there was a strong philosophical tradition stretching back to the time of the pharaohs, but also incorporating elements of Stoicism and Greek philosophy. And as we will learn, Theurgy is not illogical or irrational, but simply otherworldly, bringing into play ideas and concepts that transcend easily formulated descriptions of the mundane, yet failing to take into serious consideration the existence of other worlds and states of consciousness, as well as otherworldly entities. In the chapter on philosophy, Uždavinys wants to distinguish our current understanding of philosophy and what the theurgists like Damascus, Iamblichus, and Proclus understood it to be. He establishes that the theurgists taught that we must study philosophy as well as theurgy. But why should this be so? To do this, he must show what philosophy meant to them. Second, he is keen to demonstrate the connection between what the Greek theurgists understood philosophy to be and what the Egyptians understood it to be. This is crucial, since it is rather novel to state that the Egyptians had any notion of philosophy at all. So to show they did will help anchor Uždavinys even more, his starting contention that philosophy actually didn't begin in Greece at all, but was a continuation of contacts between Plato and ancient Egyptian thinking. So we will now see how he accomplishes this in order to achieve his ultimate goal of describing a unique and compelling reconstruction of philosophical theurgy. In the introduction, Uždavinys takes great pains to historically contextualize his argument. He asserts that modern scholarship does not properly contextualize philosophical and theurgic concepts. He seems to be saying that it is a given that all ideas and concepts are culturally determined and ideologically shaped because they are part of a larger process that he calls a myth of the divine play. This is a very mythological way of thinking of things, some might say. In deconstructing the past, he says that this is not a hindrance to accomplish something that the philosopher describes as beholding, quote, the secret and inevitable figures in the inaccessible places, unquote. Historical contextualization doesn't negate the transcendent spiritual and metaphysical truths that might be at play, as professional philosophers might think. On the contrary, contextualized thought is almost inevitable, but it is part of the very mystery of the divine that we are dealing with. He calls it the myth comprising reality. This is not an attempt to be coy or elusive. It reflects his real belief that the phenomenal world is a reflection of it's a reflection of other truths that lie behind the world we act in. It is right to remember the historical background of ideas and concepts, but this has to be done in such a way as to capture the true meaning of the thoughts being expressed. His method pays attention to historical contexts, but by real historical context, he says, ironically, these are used to produce the following. First, quote, hermeneutically constructed so as to function as organizing teleological visions and selected sets of memory, or as text-like mandalas of interrelated social and metaphysical fields, unquote. That's a very packed sentence. So I'm going to try to unpack it a little bit. Hermeneutics is the art of interpretation. He's saying he's using this art to construct the historical information into visions that will show the ends towards which they are meant to point. That is, the teleological visions. Teleological in the sense being pointing to an end or tending to an end. The memories that we have through history are selected to give us this meaning. He will create mandalas that incorporate these social and metaphysical fields. Mandalas, of course, are special pictures used in Tibetan Buddhism to inspire and direct meditation so as to lead to enlightenment. In the same way, he's saying, the historical facts he presents about theurgy and philosophy will lead us to understand what they are in their true historical contexts as he reconstructs it. Next, in a sense, quote, all texts, all signs and symbols, and all phenomena are spurious and may be likened to a drunken hallucination, a mirage. This mirage, however, is rooted in the mystery of the immanent divine self-disclosure, which resembles an endless arabesque, reflecting the image of archetype Ouroboros, unquote. This seems like a metaphysical statement of belief, but it begins with a very real sense that history, in this case, mystical texts, signs, and symbols, can seem like a dream or hallucination, a drunken hallucination, no less. Yes, true to his perennialist views, these forms are part of a divine mystery, which unfolds the phenomenal world that is an arabesque, a design consisting of intertwined flowing lines, which further reflects the snake eating its tail, the Ouroboros. These are wildly poetic and imaginatively suggestive ways to conceive of the information. Once we get into the presentation of the data, you might see where he comes up with these images. However, it is to be asked whether this is not a bit of a oversimplification or mystification on Uzdaviny's part, piling obscurity upon obscurity. When placed against Christian Bull's study of a lot of the same material, this is a real question. Next, he says, quote, therefore our investigation, though being sensitive to all available historical testimonies and details, cannot exclude or avoid certain metaphysical premises, more or less historical comparisons, unprovable no intuition, and even sometimes pretended creative misunderstanding, as Pierre Hadot perhaps would say. So here he states outright that even when he takes all precautions Sorry, I think I lost the link there for a minute. So here he states outright that even when he takes all precautions to be historically accurate, certain metaphysical and mystical intuitions will ultimately color the discussion. What are we to make of all this? We'll have to bear these considerations in mind. We must look at the evidence he advances and determine for ourselves whether the facts he brings forward justify the conclusions. In modern historical research, this way of interpreting and understanding the text is very suspect. Instead of seeing the concepts and ideas from a somewhat first-person perspective, as he does, modern historical critical methods provide numerous historical, archaeological, and philosophical facts to come to their conclusion. A single verse from the Bible might take an entire book to investigate, for example. On the other hand, the imaginative and poetic power of Uzdaviny's conclusions are undeniable. They may not reflect the historical facts in the same way that a chemical analysis of a substance establishes its reality does, but it does reflect a powerful way to see the data for further use in understanding how modern theurgy might see itself. It also helps one to operationalize the concepts and processes in one's own theurgic praxis. But it must be placed within the evolving information that continues to come to light about the sources that Uzdavinys uses, as well as supplemental sources he had no access to. Moving on, his attack on modern philosophy from the perspective of theurgic philosophy establishes a baseline for how he will proceed. First, he asserts that philosophy, quote, is a way of life as a path of inner transformation in one's search for spiritual rebirth and unity with the divine principles, unquote. What we have to explore in the coming weeks are what does he mean here by divine principles? And what does he mean by spiritual transformation and rebirth? Many of the following assertions will be elaborated with texts from the original Neoplatonic and Egyptian sources, as well as comments from modern commentaries. For example, he says that philosophy is a rite of becoming like God and a traditional sacred ritual. How can philosophy, which many would associate with logical analysis or perhaps phenomenology, be a rite? Not only that, isn't it pretty outrageous to suggest that humans can become gods? Not only does that incense almost every religion known to humans, the atheists are lining up with shotguns. Further, philosophy is contemplation in action that will lead to an ascent to heaven. These are in accord with divine patterns and archetypes, which fulfill a human's being for existing, or telos in Greek. Philosophy helps us to ascend to the transcendent one and to return to it. He says it's incorrect to think that all Eastern religions are concerned solely with liberation, or that the Western tradition has no understanding of liberation. In the Western traditions, we have Orphism and Pythagoreanism, which are dependent on Egypt and Mesopotamia for inspiration and influence. He gives us a fascinating snapshot into the method used by theurgists to elicit the help of daimons, to assist in ascending to a mystical union with the One. Proclus's commentary that engages in an imaginative allegorization of the Odyssey story involving the god Proteus, the sea nymph Adolthea, and the Homeric warrior hero Menelaus is an example that he provides. According to Proclus's interpretation, Proteus is an angelic intellect who contains within himself the forms of all things in the world. Adolthea is the mediator, the daimon, who communicates with Menelaus, since she participates in both the human and divine worlds. Proteus changes forms continually, representing the images of the world that pass before human eyes and in their imaginations. Adolthea provides Menelaus a way to see simultaneously all the forms that Proteus presents. Menelaus thereby achieves a vision of unity and oneness that transports him into union with the transcendent one. Adolthea shifts one's consciousness from the screen of ever-changing fragmentary images to the true Protean identity at the noetic level of being, quote, unquote. In other words, she helps reduce the phenomenal plurality to unity. Menelaus will die as a hero philosopher who becomes the righteous dead. As such, he will gain, quote, the magical ability to create his own psychic reality by using the words of power. unquote, which enables him to participate in demiurgic, matter-shaping activities. In this story, intellect indicates Odysseus, whose journeys in the Odyssey symbolize a work of transition, involving the transformation of one's very existence, quote unquote. Uždavinys wants us to understand that the philosophical transformation does not just include rites, however. They also include scientific discourse, hermeneutical activities, and producing commentaries such as those written by Iamblichus and Proclus, as well as Damascius. In addition, they include the activity of investigating the nature of the universe, such as those we find in the Corpus Hermeticum. Uždavinys shows how various elements of religious practices and related activities in the Eleusinian rites could evolve into philosophical processes like discourse and analysis. Religious liturgy turns into discourse, he says, and these can include magic spells, diagnostic formula, theurgic hymns that are related to understanding or contemplation, unquote. He says these become theoretical discourses, which is analogous to the sacred accounts in the Eleusinian mysteries. But these do not replace the mystical vision, the goal of Platonic contemplative philosophy, that is. They still have to be living philosophically and be tested in the ways of life versus the ways of knowledge. This is where Uždavinys begins to delineate the difference between the two types of philosophy and outlines the true philosophy. In the true philosophy, one lives philosophically, and it involves an ascent to the one accomplished by way of purification and actualization of the divine in the human. This is concrete union with the good, the one. Quote, a philosophical life is tantamount to an esoteric rite of transformation, unquote, he says. Philosophos, the word philosophos in Greek, translates the Egyptian words merek, or, quote, lover of knowledge, unquote. This word means one who is seeking liberating knowledge, wisdom, or, quote, transformation and spiritual resurrection in the realm of Osiris Ra, unquote. In the Egyptian understanding, the philosopher is a Theo-Aner, a God-man. He seeks disembodied immortality in the form of a vision of the noetic pantheon and union with the divine principles. Here, Atun Ra is the divine intellect. I said before that we need to be on the lookout for the divine principles. What are they and why are they important for immortality? Are they somehow the principles that bring life into being and guide it as it evolves through time? We still don't have that answer. So we need to remain vigilant to see where Uždavinys explains it in more detail. Uždavinys says that one step in the process to limit the understanding of what philosophy is starts with the Christian extermination of the Gnostics. This eliminated the theurgic elements from philosophy. Then Christians adopted parathetic sensualism, quote unquote, meaning Aristotelian metaphysics, which is focused on the material processes of nature and not the awareness of otherworldly dimensions or ascension practices. Logical and physical cosmological aspects of philosophy were accepted. Pagan spirituality was rejected. The philosophy and theurgic practices of Iamblichus and Proclus were transformed into mystical theology by Dionysius, the Areopagite, but the sacramental and theurgic dimensions were demonized and destroyed by the Christians. Passing down to Islam, they accepted some of what the Christians had done, but Suhrawardi introduced a new version of Neoplatonism with a renewed vision of Egyptian Hermetic wisdom. Suravardi's philosophy harkens back to the Book of the Dead, coming forth by day, which sees Ra, or the sun in metaphysical terms, as divine intellect. In his chapter called Rites of Ascent, Uždavinys begins to describe what theurgic philosophy was intended to be from its start in Egypt. Unlike the philosophical emphasis found in today's universities, which emphasize the rationalistic side of philosophy, theurgic philosophy has two aspects. The rationalistic forms one side, though perhaps not in the form it takes now, while a practical side forms the other. This latter aspect of philosophy includes the hieratic rites of spiritual ascent, out of the body to the divine plane of the gods. We need their assistance in the form of revelation, omen, and oracle to prepare ourselves for this ascent. The goal of the ascent is a vision of Plato's ideas or forms. According to the important theurgist and philosopher Proclus, the contemplation of these forms is similar to mystery rites and includes initiations and noetic visions. The term noetic here highlights the intelligible aspects of the revelations. This means they are part of a world that somehow lies outside the one we take for ordinary reality. These are related to those divine principles that I wanted you to remain vigilant for. We see more of these. Here we have them described in the way that Plato discusses them, forms and ideas, but later Uždavinys will relate them to the Egyptian pantheon. The process we must go through is a preparation of our souls to make us receptive of the divine favor. For, and it is important to remember this, the gods take the initiative and send us visions if we are pure enough to accept them. As the quote from my old teacher John Busanich notes, the soul ascends to the noetic or hanatic realm by relying both on philosophy and theology, on reason and revelation. Two things to note. The realms philosophers ascend to are the noetic, which we talked about, and the hanatic. This is the realm of the gods as depicted in Egyptian mythology. Hanad relates to unity and refers to the chain of beings that link together to form a line of communication between the other world and this world. We tend to think of these beings in mythological terms, but the theurgists saw them as logical units whose numbers could be calculated and ultimately used in relation in ritual to be called upon. Please take a look at the definitions of Hanad at the end of the book in the glossary that Uždavinys provides. Note also in the quote that there are two arms to the avenues of approach to the divine realm. These are reason and revelation. We will see Uždavinys expand on this throughout the book. Since it forms his core teaching that modern philosophy teaches us of the full story of what philosophy does and what it offers. Further, he writes that the hypostases are, quote, experiences or states of consciousness, unquote. These hypostases are those entities such as the gods whose existence we can interact with. But these can't be relied on by following a script or deducing it from principles stated by the philosophical discourse. Therefore, what we receive comes from the gods themselves. They are revelations in that sense. The gods confirm the metaphysics that stand at the core of theurgic belief. Metaphysics here means the statements about the material world and its link to the spiritual world, For Proclus, these are attested to by the gods. He is thinking here of the Chaldean oracles, which relay statements from the gods about the physical structure of the universe. The oracles related to cosmology may be based on Plato's Timaeus, one of the primary texts of theurgic practice. It's assumed that since reality is organized in the way that the Timaeus describes, theurgy and magic can work. So philosophy for these theurgists is basically hieratic rites. The rational part is important, but the practical side in the form of hieratic rites is the major part. This links philosophy to all the major mystical traditions in the ancient Mesopotamian world: Orphic, Pythagorean, Egyptian, Chaldean, based on revelation and soteriology as they are. The goal of philosophy and theurgy is to become and to achieve union with the transcendent one. But to achieve this union, we have to be purified of attachments to the material world, the bonds of generation, quote unquote. This makes us like the gods and makes us receptive to and worthy of the friendship of the gods. This is a form of sacrifice, hierorgia, or holy work, which the theurgist Iamblichus says, assimilate what is in us to the gods, even as the fire assimilates all that is solid and resistant to luminous and subtle bodies, and leads us by means of sacrifices and sacrificial fire towards the fire of the gods. Further, Iamblichus writes that it is not philosophy as rational speculation, discourses, or discursive thinking that brings us into the presence of the divine. Instead, it is accomplishing ineffable acts, hieratic mystagogy, or hierurgy, quote unquote, that prepares us to receive them and be in their presence. Otherwise, simply thinking about them or engaging in some form of philosophical discussion or contemplation could do this, which of course it doesn't. Seeing that true philosophy is comprised of these elements, therefore, we begin to see how and why it regains its Egyptian form and function. That is, returns to its roots in Egyptian cultic practice. This conception of philosophy and its Egyptian origin contradicts the popular Western myth that emphasizes a start to philosophy in Greece when Persians came to power and the wise men began talking about the nature of the world and its physics, says Uždavinys. This origin story, he thinks, is quite convenient for those in the modern world who believe in the same way. The task of Egyptian philosophy. In this section, Uždavinys continues to build on his thesis that philosophy begins in Egyptian cultic ritual and practices. He describes what the current view of philosophy is, as having been begun in Greece by Pythagoras and continued by Plato. And he says that thinking posits itself as autonomous. Its proofs and arguments are to be strictly correlated with rational comprehension, speaking and being, even though tradition and philosophy in this context still form two aspects of a single cult. But this belies the fact that philosophy and tradition are inextricably linked. And this contradicts the fact that there's a continuity of eusebia, or religious devotion that is now allied with mathematical formula. And the fact that Plato's Academy at that time still calls itself the sanctuary of the Muses, who are angelic beings that provide revelation. Damascius, the last great theurgic philosopher, defines clearly the distinction between the two aspects of philosophy. Philosophy descends from the one, he says, the one cause of all things to the lowest level of being. But the hieratic is rooted in what Uždavinys calls, quote, pericosmic causes. These involve immortality of the soul, which is Egyptian. This is identified with Theurgy, worship of the gods, which further emphasizes salvation of the soul after its life and generation. Pericosmic here means, quote, an intermediate level between the divine and the material world, unquote. In this regard, worship of the gods creates a link between their world and this world and establishes the ability to save the soul from oblivion, but more importantly, to allow it the ability to travel between the worlds. Uždavinys calls this dyadic combination of hieratic and discourse philosophies integrated philosophy. Plato calls those who practice the integrated philosophy Bacchuses, after the god Bacchus or Dionysus. Damascus describes philosophy as the form of Bacchus as an initiation rite. The first Bacchus, he says, is Dionysus, whose ecstasy manifests itself in dancing and shouting, that is, in every form of movement of which he is the cause. According to Plato's work, the Laws, but one who has dedicated himself to Dionysus, having become his image, shares his name also. And when a man leads a Dionysian life, his troubles are already ended, and he has been freed from his bonds, and released from custody, or rather from the confined form of life. Such a man is a philosopher in the stage of purification. Damascus favors the hieratic. It transcends, quote, philosophical common sense, unquote. In addition, he seems to equate real philosophy with the hieratic rites and their esoteric interpretations, linking their dissemination to creating and exposing holy statues and relics from the esoteric temple of Isis in Egypt. Still, philosophy is not a Greek invention, and instead it is from the Egyptians. Important to realize and remember that Uždavinys is showing how Greek and Egyptian concepts conform to each other, since Egyptians were the first philosophers. This includes Egyptian soteriology. Important points that Greek version of philosophy adapt from the Egyptian include the following: the immortal soul, the rending the soul and body asunder and then having to reassemble it, the return of the soul to God, and finally, the soul is no longer regarded as a phantom, as it used to be in Greece, but is immortal. For Uždavinys, the Greeks adopted the important understanding that one's real being, one's immaterial and divine essence, to be delivered from the illusory prison-like body and reintegrated into the divine realm of eternal archetypes. Plato understands this, taking the Orphic and the Pythagorean traditions and rationalizing them. This means he takes mystical and mystery phenomena and translates them discursively or into the language of philosophy. For Plato, the concentration and purification of the soul, unification with the one, good, remembrance of past lives, separation of the soul from the body, and spiritual ascent to the one, these are symbolized by Dionysus, who equates the Egyptian god Osiris, and Apollo, who is Horus Ra. Again, this involves a return to what the soul itself is. That is, a return to the divine intellect and transcendent one. According to Damascus, again, this means the soul, quote, starting from all the points of the body where it has been dispersed, gathers the soul back to itself so that reassembled and unified, it can unbind itself from the body and escape from it, unquote. Therefore, the lived, hieratic side of integrated philosophy has 3 steps. Disengage from the body, withdrawal from the logical into intuitive thinking, be possessed by the divine. In the chapter on time and the life of the spectator, Uzdavinys is asking, what does a life spent in the hieratic side of philosophy look like? What is the relationship between Egyptian festivals and the Eleusinian mysteries? These are questions Uzdavinys takes up in the chapter on time. In general, he has alluded to the fact already that philosophical insight and revelation resemble what are called apopteia. This term originates in the Eleusinian mysteries and designates the mystical vision that the initiates experience at the conclusion of the sacred rites in Eleusis. The term is also related to concepts associated with the many meanings of revelation, when oracles are conveyed to his listeners and so on. The general idea, then, is that the philosophical enterprise results in special types of intellectual knowledge and awareness. For one of the founders of Neoplatonism, the great Plotinus, the spectator in philosophical pursuits is a contemplative, viewing the hieratic symbols and icons, because, quote, every image is a kind of knowledge and wisdom, unquote, for whom true wisdom is generic being, true substances, and wisdom. An important link between Greek philosophy and Egyptian is in the form of the cyclical festivals of Egyptian religion. Uzdavinys says these resemble and line up with Orphic and Pythagorean mysteries. The festivals were events in time when, quote, the deceased could hope to return after death, unquote. During the festivals, the Egyptian initiates seek to gaze upon the face of the gods. Uzdavinys thinks that these gods translate into Plato's noetic forms or ideas. Heliophanies, quote, living images that reflect their intelligible archetypes and function as noetic vehicles for the bow of the gods, the neturu. Important here is that he says that the embalming vision or the gaze of the initiate is not dissecting or separating, but integrative and anagogic, unquote. It is important for Uzdavinys to point this out, since it's the integrative side of philosophy that he wants to show is missing from how philosophy is usually conceived. The idea that the apoptic vision from the Eleusinian mysteries is a model for the Greek vision of divine reality then has to be reintegrated, not analytical, but like discursive thought is. That the apoptic vision is not analytical or discursive, as it's often thought to be. This is why he sets up immortality of the soul. This is why he sets up the opposition between dissecting or separating, but integrative and anagogic. Integrative is pretty clear here because we have spoken about it before. Anagogic is a new term. It actually comes from theurgic terminology conveyed by the Chaldean theurgists. It means to rise or ascend to the gods. An anagogic vision is a result of preparation, dialectic, purification, contemplation, sacred rites, and ascent. And again, see the definitions in the back of the book in the glossary. While we are doing this, we can also look at 2 concepts from Egyptian practice. These include the bow and the neturu, which you can take a look at in the glossary. Theoretical knowledge, it is important to realize, is a part of true wisdom, however, contrary to what it might seem in the way that Uždavinys characterizes modern philosophy. But in Plotinus's thought and in the thought of the Theurgists, these are true substances, not just mental abstractions. The aim of philosophy is not to produce discursive accounts. It is rather to find the divine spark within us and to ascend by worship or contemplation or dialectical ascent. So he writes, quote, "The contemplative philosopher knows sensible things insofar as he reduces them from their own plurality to the unity of the intelligible. But since in the intelligible there is not only unity, but also plurality, he reduces the unity in the intelligible to the unity that is in God, which is unity proper without multiplicity. For God is nothing but a monad without multiplicity. That is, God is nothing but a unity without multiplicity. Contemplation and the contemplative dialectic are the art of purification and catharsis. That is the genetic union of all reality. Theurgists, like the Hellenic philosophers, then, in Egyptian terms, follow one's heart, which is what the Egyptians actually called it. So then, to sum up these sections of chapter 1, we have gone from thinking of philosophy as a purely intellectual activity. Instead, we see that philosophy is comprised of two separate but equal parts. One is intellectual, in that it deals with concepts, learning dialectic, engaging in debate and logical analysis. The other part is ritualistic. It engages the soul and prepares it for ascent to the gods, where we can experience mystical union with the source of all things, the divine principles and archetypes, the One. We have also learned that the theurgic process engages with entities that will help us in the ascent. We haven't heard too much about them yet, but we will in later sections. This is more the theurgic part of this book. But remember the story about Menelaus and Proteus, and how the nymph Adolphe helped Menelaus attain a vision that unified the multiplicity of images and shapes that Proteus was displaying to Menelaus, and forms those into a unification of all of the images. Then we began to see that perhaps philosophy did not have its beginnings in Greece, as many of the current rationalistic scholars think. It has its past in Egypt, where the priests and their initiates engaged in religious rites that prepare them for ascent to the gods, where they can find union as well with the One, finding a vision that unifies the multiplicity of life into a mystical oneness. We have also been introduced to the idea that we will begin to see described the magical vision that philosophy and theurgy are said to produce, the ability to create mental realities and to travel between the worlds of the living and the dead. That's my introduction, and again, I apologize for the length of this. Next time, we will begin a discussion of these parts of chapter 1 of Algis Uždavinys' book, Philosophy and Theurgy. Thanks for joining us today, and I hope to see you next time.